I'm Alpher.
I'm Omegar.
This is Delta. And we're Alpher and Omega.
And this is Alpher Omegar's Refit Review. The original series, pilot number 1. The Cage.
Heyo! So, as the man said, we're going to be reviewing The Cage today. The first pilot that they did for the original series back in 1964. It's Delta's favourite.
Delta's favourite, that's why he's decided to join us on the big red couch today.
Yeah. So, in terms of Star Trek, I'm well versed in it. I've seen all Star Trek start to finish multiple times, and Omegar has not necessarily.
I've seen all of Voyager, I've seen all of Enterprise, I've seen bits and pieces of DS9 and Next Generation.
Next Generation movies.
I've seen the Next Generation movies, that's my biggest experience there. With them, and then
Piecemeal here and there.
Piecemeal here and meal here, everything else. I've seen an episode of the animated series, which actually is kind of related to this pilot a little bit. Interesting, isn't it?
So, as you may or may not know, The Cage was the original pilot that Gene Roddenberry put together for NBC back in 1964, and it starred Jeffrey Hunter as the Captain Christopher Pike.
Christopher Pike, not Kirk.
Not Kirk.
Not Kirk. Pike.
No.
Not this guy.
No.
It's Pike.
Well, Spock was there.
Spock was there though.
Yeah.
But not as the first officer.
And not quite as the man we know,
No.
Later and for the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Really, so that was kind of interesting. They show Spock with emotions and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And in terms of the differences between this pilot and later incarnations of the original series, certainly Spock was not as prominent a role, but he was still there in quite a role. He had quite a bit to do. He had quite a speaking
part.
lines,
quite a few lines.
Yeah. And then, of course, Major Barrett as number one.
Number one, yeah.
Yeah, original number one.
The original number one.
Yeah. She was great, but apparently the network, in their feedback, because they ultimately went to a second pilot, obviously, but part of their feedback was, you've either got to get rid of Leonard Nimoy or this woman on the bridge. We can't have her in command, at least. And so, I don't know how that went over at night with his wife, but he chose Spock.
One of those things stayed.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. It would have been kind of nice to see the character development, because they did play her off as sort of emotionless in the show. Like, kind of as if like the only way a woman could get there to that point is, to like number one to command, as if she didn't have any emotions. But it was revealed later through a little plot twist that she had in fact had feelings for the captain.
Well, she had these feelings, but to everyone around her, like, to achieve her success, Pike specifically says at one point that he's not used to having a woman on the bridge. She's right there, and she gives this look, and he's like, "Oh, you're different, number one." It's like, for a second I thought, is he saying what I think he's saying about her sexuality? But then, no, as it's revealed, it's just, no, he's not. He's just completely an idiot as far as women goes, and he thinks that because she's removed sexuality or whatever, and it's just this, like, robotic thing, that's how she got there. And that's offensive.
Well, and it is a little bit, he did kind of call it a little, because I know in the most recent season of Suits, Jessica Pearson, the main lead female character of the head of the law firm, she had actually specifically said, like, to get where she was, she had to do things that were kind of viewed by some as ruthless, because if she showed any sort of compassion, it was viewed as weakness. So she had to be ruthless to get where she was. And then, of course, she, decides that she's at a time in her life where she'd rather have more friends than enemies. But, but she does pretty much echo what Roddenberry said back then.
But that's horrible.
It is kind of horrible. It's horrible that that's where we are, but he did kind of, he did call it, and hopefully that's not where we really are. It's a television show after all. Like, hopefully in the actual corporate world, it's gotten to be a bit.
Well,
I don't know.
Know your value,
Know
ladies.
your values.
Shout out. Hashtag Mika Brzezinski. Hashtag know your value. Anyway,
Anywho.
so what did you think of the Cage, having
So
never
the
been...
Cage, having not seen it before,
Yeah.
it was actually, I mean, it was pretty good. It focused a little too much on just the captain himself. There wasn't really any much real character to anyone else. There was one of my
Really, like, only Pike, number one, Spock, and the Doctor have a number of lines. Then the helm officer, I forget his name.
I don't remember his name.
He has a few lines, and then there's
this other blue shirt guy he's always on, like he was the third one. He just shoots his phaser at the rock wall, and they show him a number of times, and he's just always just looking like
he's very intense,
looking so intently.
He does a very good job with his looks.
And he gets one line, I forget what it is in the actual episode, but he responds to something Spock says. But that's not his favorite character.
No, my favorite character is the guy who's guarding the turbo lift on the bridge. Watch the episode. He looks like they beat him if he does anything wrong, like constantly.
It is amusing. He does look quite frightened.
He does.
But yeah, the overall, so the plot, they're off in space on a rescue mission or to assist.
Well, no, they have just had their encounter on Rigel 7 and are now headed to the Vega colony to drop off people who are injured and whatnot. At which point they get the radio transmission from the alleged survivors.
Something rushing at them through space. It's radio wave.
Radio. But it gets there and suggests that there are survivors from the Columbia, which is, a long since lost ship, and so they go and they go off to rescue the people, and so that's kind of the setup for the show, and then they arrive at the Talos Star Group, and Talos 4 is in class,
and it turns out it's a trap.
Yeah, wrong
franchise.
Yeah. So it is a trap, though. The Telosians have set this trap. But what did you think of the Telosians?
The Telosians were quite creepy, like with their big heads and
they
their
really
pulsing veins. They actually did pretty.
I thought they held up
well,
amazingly well
for villains. I mean, for aliens of the time. Yeah.
I honestly don't know that I've ever seen the Cage or the Menagerie in HD, and seeing the little in that was really well done.
And creepy.
Really well done.
And creepy, yeah. But yeah, and of course, it ends up, it's sort of like a zoo, like...
Yeah, kind of a zoo of reality in the mind.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of creatures there, and Pike is the perfect specimen to go with their female human that they had.
But that's not really what they're trying to do. That's what they've been doing all along. But apparently, as it turns out, what they're trying to do is find two people or a species that will be able to learn and repopulate the surface of Talos 4 under the tutelage of the Telosians, so that they don't
become artisans.
So the Telosians have these mental powers which allow them to make you think you're in some sort of, different environment.
Probe your mind.
Different people around, that sort of thing. And so, they've learned this power after the war on the surface of the planet drove them underground.
Deep underground.
And while underground, they learned how to do this sort of thing. But they know that in the wrong hands, this sort of power would lead to the destruction of another civilization, so they don't want to do that.
Because, it's kind of led to the end of their civilization, because they've just relived the memories of others, and they've sort of forgotten how to even rebuild their own technology or repair it. So they've kind of doomed
themselves. And who tells us that?
Yeah.
How do we learn that?
We learn that from the human, the last surviving human of the actual Columbia, who they found.
A little girl at the time.
A little girl, they
Vina.
They repaired her, and
she assures us that, much like Data in the Next Generation, she assures us that everything works. But the Telosians were looking for a breeding pair. But now, in terms of the message of this, what did you think of the message of this episode?
The message was a little bit strange, because, at the end of it, so the Telosians end up letting Pike go because they they download Earth's history from the the tapes and micro records, and then they just find that humans have just such a hatred for being in captivity, for being slaves, that they're like, you're too violent, and they just let them go.
Mm-hmm.
Because they would be too violent to be in captivity. It's like, so...
Like, everyone wouldn't feel that way. Like, chimpanzees don't feel that way. Or, like Romulans wouldn't have a distaste of being in captivity. Oh, that seems strange, right?
It is kind of funny, though, because in one of the visions that they give Pike, they've got the girl as an Orion female, and one of the actual fake people there makes the comment, they're a strange race, they actually like being taken advantage of.
Well, see, interestingly enough, that's retconned in with Enterprise, as you well know, with the Orion slave girls being the actual ones who were in charge of the Orion civilization.
Mm.
But
that is true.
But yeah, so I mean that's an interesting. There was a Next Generation episode where they had taken Picard and a couple of other species and was this group, and they were studying them, and then at the end they were like, "Oh, we didn't realize you didn't like to be captive." Once they had been made captive, and it's like, well,
why wouldn't you know that? The one episode of the animated series that I saw was, I think they were like these kind of slugs, giant worms or something that had captured, it was Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and they were keeping them in an actual zoo, and at the end of it, they actually let them go because they realized, somehow, I forget exactly, that they're sentient beings, and they're like, oh, well, since you're sentient, like, how bad? Here you go. All these other animals can stay here. But
think about that. That was an animated series episode from the early 70s, and here we are in the 20-teens, the second half of the 20-teens, and we're just now starting to release or take dolphins and whales out of shows where we have them in captivity doing tricks for us and things like that. So I mean it's interesting, but in terms of the other message, like. So Pike ends up escaping from all of this, and they end up rejecting him initially because he's too violent. And it seems like the moral of the story was it was humanity's ability to keep its violence that enabled him to overcome the Telosians, which was a very strange message to me.
It was a bit of a strange message, and then so the girl who had survived, you find, is actually quite deformed because when they put her back together, they didn't have a human reference. So she's not...
Not that she would have looked much different than the Telosians if they just used them. But
if they just use them...
Star Trek.
Star Trek. So, but then they give her the illusion of her beauty and give her the illusion that Pike actually stays with her, which is, I mean, I guess, sort of a kind of...
It's no different than Rose staying with the fake doctor.
Yeah, I suppose. But I mean, she's in a real reality with an actual, basically, clone of the doctor, whereas she's in a illusion.
Yeah, but she does get a happily ever after, ultimately. It does ultimately.
I mean, because she was really into it. She wanted that to be...
No, I mean, well, spoiler.
Oh!
Spoiler. She ultimately does get him, so...
So, yeah. Anyway.
So, any other thoughts about the first episode? The first pilot?
So, it is, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see the shift where Spock does become sort of the emotionless character. They pretty much kind of merge him with number one, and just then decide they get to make the Vulcans then just...
Illogical, non-emotional.
Cold, logical beings. Which, I mean, it actually worked out, and it was... quite fascinating, and
I mean, it worked out.
I really liked an Enterprise where they showed kind of
the
different Vulcans before they had went through their cultural or spiritual revolution, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, it was, yeah.
But yeah, I mean that was pretty fascinating, kind of interesting
Finding
to see.
Sulrak again.
Good.
Yeah. So, basically, we'll be going through the rest of the original series and then on into the other series in order. So tune in next week for the Refit review. Until next week, that's this week.
For Alpher Omegar.
Ayo!